Welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where we are getting real close to the end of the book of Genesis. We'll be looking at chapter 48 and 49 today. That leaves us only one chapter left before we come to the end of the book. Well, in case you haven't joined us before, we're talking about the lives of the patriarchs. These are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these are the people that God singled out to become the father, basically Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel, this special chosen people. And so what we're talking about now is we've looked at the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is the life of Jacob. And Jacob is now coming to the end of his life. All kinds of exciting things have happened with him. But we find him now living not in the land of Canaan, where he spent most of his life, but now living in Egypt. And this all comes about as a result of a famine that required him to move to the land of Egypt, where his son just happens to be second in command. And Joseph gets word that his father is failing. And so he packs up his stuff and makes a trip to this land of Goshen, and also brings his two sons, his eldest sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. I'm not sure if they had ever met their grandfather before up until this time, but he thought it was appropriate, knowing that his father Jacob was about to pass away, that he should meet his two grandsons. And this is pretty much the context of what we are looking at today. But the overall theme is, as Jacob comes to the end of his life, is this theme of passing the blessing down to the next generation. We've already seen how this was such an important part of the culture at that time. Abraham, of course, blessing his son Isaac and passing that same blessing down to him. Isaac passing his blessing down to Jacob. Of course, there was that old story about how Jacob sort of tricked his father into giving him the inheritance that his older brother Esau should have gotten. This is part of that story, and part of the lineage, or part of the heritage, I guess we could say, reputation of Jacob himself. But now it's Jacob's turn to pass the blessing down to his descendants. And now he's got 12 sons, and he also has these two grandsons. And we know that there were 12 tribes of Israel, and 12 was an important number. And I guess the question is going to come now, if he's got 12 sons, and then we put these other two grandsons in the mix, how do you end up with 12 tribes? Well, we'll try to get into that and try to figure that out as we look at this today. But we start out, and this is the situation where Joseph has come now to see Jacob, and Jacob is going to pass the blessing down to these two grandsons, which he, at this point, at least in the way the narrative is given, he does this before he blesses his own sons. So this is what we read in Genesis chapter 48, and starting in verse 5. Now then, your two sons, born to you in Egypt, before I came to you here, will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours. In the territory they inherit, they will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. What are we saying here? It's interesting that Jacob acknowledges these first two sons of Joseph as if they were his sons. So Manasseh, the older one, and Ephraim, the younger one, really become his sons, and he doesn't acknowledge them just as grandsons or as sons of Joseph. But he says, just like Reuben and Simeon, Reuben and Simeon were his oldest sons. And those in those days, again, the older ones seemed to be more important or more valued or have more responsibility than the younger ones. We're going to see how that didn't necessarily work out that way for Reuben, but he mentioned specifically, just like Reuben and Simeon, my very first two sons, are my sons, so these two grandchildren of mine are going to be considered as sons. And this is what we read in this blessing that he gives to them. We read a little bit more in verse 15 of chapter 48. And then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of my father Abraham, Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth." And so this is kind of like an extra little extension of blessing. And he's making it so clear that he wants them to be part of this promise that God had made to his grandfather Abraham, and that they would be equally involved in that promise. But just only the first two sons of Joseph. And this chapter ends with kind of an interesting verse that talks about how Jacob says God is going to bless you, or God is going to bring you one day back to the land of your forefathers. This is what Jacob is telling Joseph. And the interesting thing here is that, well, we know that Joseph actually never goes back to the land of Canaan. He continues, he lives out his life there in Egypt and, takes the responsibilities that he has all the way to the grave. And he never returns to Canaan. So what do we understand about this promise that Jacob makes to Joseph? Well, this actually comes to fulfillment like 400 years later, when Israel is in Egypt and they leave Egypt and they bring Joseph's bones with them. 400 years later, this prophecy actually comes true. They bring Joseph's bones with him so that he can be buried in the land of Canaan. God might take some time in fulfilling his promises, but he always fulfills his promises. Well, this brings us to chapter 49. So this was the first part of the blessings of Jacob. And then we get to his other 12 sons, and he pronounces a blessing on each one of them. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time, but we're going to just pinpoint some really interesting things about this, because these blessings that he gives to his other 12 sons, in order of their birth, he starts with Reuben and Simeon and goes down according to their birth order, actually become prophetic. And we see how the things that he says about each one of these sons actually does, in some ways, come true later on, after these 400 years in Egypt, and when they enter the promised land and start to define themselves as a nation, the nation of Israel. So we start out with Reuben. Reuben, in verse 3 of chapter 49, "You are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power, turbulent as the waters. You will no longer excel, for you went up into your father's bed, unto my couch, and defiled it." Well, I don't know if you remember that little verse that was mentioned about Reuben, is that he had this indiscretion with one of his father's concubines, Bilhah, and as a result, he lost his position as being the firstborn son. Now, normally the firstborn son, according to tradition, would receive a double blessing, a double portion of the inheritance. And Reuben sort of loses out on that, very much in the same way that Esau, foolishly sold his birthright. Now Reuben, because of his indiscretion, loses his position, or what would have been his position, as the most honored of all the sons. And it is interesting to see when he ends up, you follow the history of Israel, that his tribe eventually sort of is diminished in the role of Israel. They don't play a big part in the role of Israel, as you might expect they would. So what you do has profound effects not just on your future, but upon the future of all your descendants. And this is what we see having happened with Reuben. Simeon and Levi, they're the next in line. These two brothers, and if you'll remember, they were the ones that came up with this plan to kill the Shechemites, and things didn't go so well for them. This is what, this is the part of the blessing that they receive. In verse 7 of chapter 48, cursed be their anger so fierce and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Well, we find out, because if you'll recall, they really stirred up a hornet's nest of trouble for Jacob and the rest of their family when they did this, killed all of the men of Shechem. It did not earn them a lot of respect, maybe a lot of fear, but not a lot of respect. And even Jacob, their father, was not proud of what they had done. And because it brought such trouble to their family. And as a result, I don't know if you remember, Jacob decided it's time for us to pack up and just get out of here because of what these guys have done. What Simeon and Levi have done is just going to bring, all of this tension between us and our neighbors. So they had to leave. And it is interesting that the tribe of Simeon ends up more or less being dissolved into the tribe of Judah. And so they don't end up playing a prominent role as a tribe in the nation of Israel. And again, I think it's because of this tendency towards violence, and they end up paying the price for that. It's also interesting, the tribe of Levi. Now, they get scattered in a different way. They sort of lose their identity as a tribe only in a different way, because they are the ones who are chosen to be the priests in Israel. And as a result, they don't really receive one spot of land like all the other tribes did. But they end up being dispersed throughout Israel as they perform their priestly duties. And so they end up in a different sort of a way, I guess you could say, losing their identity as a tribe. And this gets down to answering that question of why did Jacob adopt Ephraim and Manasseh as his sons? Because we lost Levi, and Joseph himself is not identified as a tribe, but he is identified through these two sons. So if you're following the math, basically it means now we're still back to 12 tribes. We've eliminated Levi, and Joseph himself is not acknowledged as a tribe, but his two sons become two separate tribes. So in a way, Joseph is represented by two tribes. But we end up at the number 12 anyway, in case you're not following all that. Well, who is next? Judah. The part of the blessing for Judah is in verse 10. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. This is a really big blessing. It's very important because Judah, it says here, he is destined to rule. And we find out that the descendants of Judah, the tribe of Judah, and this, again, all these years later, 400 years plus a bunch more before the kings of Israel start to step into their position. But we find out that the descendants of Judah are the ones who primarily fulfill that role as kings of Israel. And so this prophecy, this blessing that Jacob gives to Judah really does come true. But it's even more important than that, because it talks about this one, until whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nation shall be his. This is a reference to the Messiah, to Jesus Christ. And in other words, we know that through Abraham the world was going to be blessed in reference to Christ coming, and through Isaac, and through Jacob. But now you've got 12 more sons. And who is going to be the one that will be the father of the Messiah? Not necessarily the father, but through whose line the Messiah will come. And the answer is Judah. And we see that that's why Christ is called the Lion of Judah, because we find out that when Jesus was born, he had to come, the Messiah had to come from this line of Judah. And it's very clear in all the genealogies that that's where Jesus came from. So this is pretty big in terms of, the Bible and God's overall plan for mankind. The next one in line is Zebulun. It says that Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships. His border will extend towards Sidon. And this is interesting because the place where he ends up, and you have to remember, this is Jacob telling these things to his kids. They still have 400 years to dwell in Egypt before they even head towards the promised land, and then a number of other years until the land is actually divided up and they receive these portions of land that is promised to them. But he mentions specifically about Zebulun that he will live by the seashore. And as it turns out, the tribe of Zebulun finds themselves on this major trade route between the east and the west. And that's an interesting thing about Israel, is that they find themselves kind of in the center of everything. They still are today. And all of the trade that's going back and forth between the east and the west has to go through Israel. And they end up becoming very prosperous because of this. And Sidon is mentioned along with Phoenicia as two of these trading partners that Israel has. And the tribe of Zebulun plays a key role in all of that. So you see how this prophecy actually does come true. Next one is Issachar in verse 14. Issachar is a raw-boned donkey lying down among the sheep pens. When he sees how good is his resting place and how pleasant is his land, he will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. How do we see this coming about in the actual fulfillment of prophecy? Well, Issachar actually ends up in a land where they become farmers. And as a result, they become a great blessing to the nation of Israel by providing food. It talks about how they kind of roll up their sleeves and, he's a raw-boned donkey, but they submit to the burden that's cast upon them. But as a result, they become very successful as farmers who provide for the needs of the nation. Now, we have kind of an analogy here in America. We talk about the Midwest as being the breadbasket of the country, and that's really true. If we didn't have the Midwest growing all that corn and grain, and we'd be in big trouble. If we just went from the East Coast to the mountains and didn't have all this very fruitful land in between, we'd be in a lot of trouble. But it was similar here with the nation of Israel, is that they had this one source of blessing through this agricultural pursuit by the tribe of Issachar. The next one is Dan, verse 16. Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels, so that its riders will tumble backward. I'm not sure if that would be considered a blessing or a curse. I mean, if I received this as a blessing from my father, I'm not sure how I would feel about it. But as it turns out, and if we follow the history of Israel, Dan really does become kind of a problem child. Every family has a problem child, and in a way, Dan fits that role in the nation of Israel. There were some issues when they finally did enter the promised land about the land that was going to be allotted to them. And there were some discord, I guess, in that regards. And we find out that their history in Israel was really one of disruption. And eventually, I think we might have mentioned this, they sort of lose their identity as a tribe altogether. And, it's unfortunate. Every family has the kids they're proud of. Every family has the kids they're maybe not quite so proud of. And Dan seems to fit that role. But it's interesting, the things that Jacob says about them eventually do come true. The next one is Gad. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. This is a pretty short blessing upon them, or prediction, I guess we could say. But it's interesting how this all plays itself out, because Gad, the tribe of Dan, they end up living on the east side of the Jordan River. And if you can picture a map, most of the tribes were located on the west side of the Jordan River, but a few of them ended up on the east side. And what that meant was they would be the first tribes that would encounter most of the enemies of Israel, because most of the enemies of Israel were on the east side. The west side was the sea, so there wasn't anybody over there. There were some people over there that caused some problems, but for the most part, the tribe of Gad, Gad would be the ones that would be the first ones to be encountered by their enemies. Now, as a result, and I think that's why they're described this way, that he will be attacked by a band of raiders, and this really describes pretty much what happened with the tribe of Gad. But the interesting thing about them, because of this, they became very excellent warriors. In fact, David mentions in the book of Chronicles how important the Gadites were to Israel in all of its military efforts. So this is another interesting thing about how God uses these various descendants of Jacob's children. Asher is the next one. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. I'm not really sure how that carries itself out, or how that showed itself in the tribe of Asher, but we get the sense that they were very prosperous, and that as a result, I'm not really sure what it means about delicacies fit for a king, but maybe they grew all the dates and the special things that that would be a sign of great prosperity. I'm not real sure how that works out. We come down to the next one, which is Naphtali. Naphtali, it said in verse 21, is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. And that's, again, another really short one, but what do we see in the tribe of Naphtali? And that is that they end up, it's just interesting, they end up settling in the land around the Sea of Galilee. And if I had the privilege of being in Israel and going up to this area of Galilee, and it really is a very beautiful kind of a wooded, it stands different than the southern part of Israel, which is mostly a desert. But you go up into that northern part in Galilee, and it's beautiful. The Sea of Galilee with the mountains surrounding it and the woods, and it's just a very beautiful place. So he's talking about them being like a doe, like a deer, and this is a perfect setting for that. The interesting thing, too, about Galilee is that this is the area in Israel where Jesus does most of his miracles and his ministry. So we come next to Joseph, and we're almost to the end of the list. Joseph is a fruitful vine in verse 22, a faithful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attack him. They shoot at him with hostility. But his bow remained steady. His strong arm stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd of the rock of Israel. Now there's some imagery here that pretty much describes the life of Joseph. And one of them is this idea that his branches climb over a wall. I think what that would have symbolized is that his life affected more than just his own family and even just Egypt, because of the profound effect what he did had on that whole area. Because we know that famine went beyond just Egypt itself. And the whole surrounding area, people were coming to get food. So he ends up having this effect, and I think that's the image of his vine climbs over the wall. In other words, he gets into other nations and other areas. His life affects those other areas. But it also talks about these archers, that there were these archers that were shooting arrows at him. And who would that be? Well, actually, it was his brothers. I think that's an image of his brothers who at one point were trying to kill him. But then it goes on and it uses this image of how his bow remained strong. And I think we talked about that, about how his life had all these ups and downs. But he was never discouraged. And when he was going through these difficult times, he still managed to to be faithful to God and to overcome all of these different things that came into his life. And so that he successfully defeated these arrows that were cast, that were shot at him. So this one I think this was very interesting. He also he's described as being a prince among his brothers, and that's exactly what happens. He is a prince among his brothers, and we'll remember that dream that he had when he was just young, about how he saw all of his brothers bowing down before him, and that wasn't just figurative, that was something that literally happened. So we end up with Benjamin, the young one, this is Joseph's younger brother. And that describes him as being a ravenous wolf. In the morning, he devours the prey. In the evening, he divides the plunder. And again, we don't know that much about Benjamin, except for the fact that his tribe does play an important role in the military activity of Israel, that his descendants really do become fierce warriors. And just another curious thing about this tribe of Benjamin is that we find two of his descendants are kind of interesting. One is Saul, who was the first king of Israel. Things didn't end up quite so well with him in terms of his role as king. But the other one was Paul, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Now, the Apostle Paul certainly wasn't a warrior in the military sense, but he was a warrior in terms of the spiritual sense. Paul is the one that talks about putting on the whole armor of God, because he is a spiritual warrior. And I think this is maybe something part of the character of Benjamin that he inherited as well. So how do we end all this? What do we conclude? Well, the last verse simply says that these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said according to each of them as he blessed them. And it says that he gave each one of them a blessing appropriate to that individual. So I think one of the things we can conclude, and one of the lessons we learn here, is that God does have a plan for each one of us, and it's not always the same plan. He doesn't make us, okay, you're going to be a Christian, and I want you to be exactly like this, and he makes us all the same. No, he doesn't. Each one of us has different gifts, and each one of us has different abilities, and God needs all kinds of people in his church to fill his kingdom and to fulfill his will. Just like Israel needed all of these different kinds of people in order to make the nation as a whole prosperous and successful. So God does different things with each one of us. Another lesson we learn is that we do suffer the consequences of our actions, and we saw that very clearly with Simeon and Levi and their tendency towards violence, and most certainly with Reuben, who had this indiscretion with one of his father's concubines, and as a result he lost his position as the firstborn son, and he lost that inheritance. So there's that's a pretty consistent spiritual lesson and spiritual truth that is always in effect. But the main thing is we learn about God's sovereignty. He gives Jacob this insight. I mean, I wish I could be able to tell my kids because of my blessing on them, that this is going to happen to you and everything's going to be okay. Or, I've not really had that opportunity or that privilege or that ability to predict in my own kids' lives what they would be. All I can do is love them and instruct them and, just hope they make the right decisions. But it's just really interesting how these things that Jacob was telling his sons really are like prophetic. And they all really did come true, which just as a reminder that this God that Jacob was serving is the sovereign God who is in control of all things. Only he can pull this together and make all these things happen. So this is the God that we serve. He hasn't changed. He is the same in character, and he wants to do very special things in each one of our lives. So I think this is probably a good part of what we learn in these blessings that Jacob passes down to his sons and grandsons, and how God maintains the order in the nation of Israel through these, all these things that were happening. And I also hope that you'll be able to join us next time as we conclude the book of Genesis.